Hello, this is Steve Bonacontri from Angular Orange, giving you a tutorial today on the command line interface. Okay, CLI is Angular's command line interface tool used to initialize, develop, scaffold, and maintain Angular applications. To install it, you could just do an npm install -g for global Angular CLI. And to use it, you could do an ng space new space my project name and generate a project. Then you could cd into that project and you could do things like ng serve. You could start up the server to serve your application. That server will be using WebSockets to update your application as you make changes to your TypeScript files and your style sheets, etc. So when you do an ng serve, you navigate to localhost port 4200 and the app will automatically reload if you change any of the source files. Now, just want to make a recommendation. Get the latest and greatest WebStorm development tool, install it. It'll come with Node 6. It'll be based on Angular CLI. It'll build Angular for projects, or 5, depending on when you install this thing. And also we'll use the latest and greatest version of TypeScript, which I believe is 2.2 or something. And your projects will be created with all the proper resources when you let WebStorm create your project using Angular CLI. And so I recommend that approach, but let's move on talking about Angular CLI. Once your project is created, you will use Angular CLI for a number of different things. Okay, first of all, you could cd into your project and do an ng-v to see what version that's being used. It'll show you the Angular CLI is version 1, your Node is version 6, and it'll show you all your packages that are installed for that project and what version you're using. And so this is a good way to determine whether you're using Angular 4 or not. Okay, so like I said, you can create a new project. You could do commands, do an ng space completion to add autocomplete functionality to your shell for ng commands. You could run end-to-end tests in your application using Protractor by doing an ng space end-to-end. You could build and serve your application rebuilding on file changes. For example, you could do an ng serve, or you get help on Angular by doing ng space help. That'll give you help on the Angular CLI tool. And you'll be surprised, you'll get a lot of results from ng help. And if you go through those results, you'll get a better idea of what you can do. Okay, now these are things that you will definitely use. To generate new code inside your project, you do an ng space generate. The possible scenarios, you could do an ng space generate component customer to generate a customer component. You could do an ng space generate directive to generate a directive. And you could generate a pipe or a service. Now, some of these things by default will create their own directory. And that directory, let's say for the first scenario, for generating the customer component, will generate a customer directory. Now, we don't usually do that. Usually what we do is we'll create a components directory, a services directory, a directives directory, and we put all our components there. So I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Okay, so the generate component has its own directory by default. The generate component that does not have its own directory, you could basically do this -- flat. And so what I found is when using CLI, there's different things that happen at different times. I don't know why. When I first started using it, it was generating things in a components directory. Now I have to actually specify the components directory. So, Angular is changing rapidly. CLI is changing. Just make sure that you know how it works and be able to use it. Okay, so what I always do is I do an ng space generate component. I put it in the components directory. I make sure it has its own directory called customer, and I'm creating a customer component. And the same thing for services. Now, one thing you'll notice is that when you generate a component, it works. It generates the test file, it generates things, and it works by default. It adds it to the module, it adds the appropriate imports and stuff like that. When you generate services, it doesn't list it as a provider. You actually go into the module, you have to specify it as a provider to actually inject it into a constructor of a component. So just keep that in mind. That makes sure everything works when you generate these resources. Okay, and then you could do different things. I can get the value of an Angular CLI configuration. So if you do an ng space get space e to e, what you'll find is that that name in the Angular CLI JSON file is actually pointing to a protractor configuration file. To set the value of an Angular CLI configuration, do an ng space set space project.name, let's say myseed, and it will actually change the project name to, well, it should be myseed. Okay, and then you can build an application for production. If you set up GitHub repository and publish the application, you could actually do this. I don't particularly use GitHub pages to deploy web apps. I'm actually using Amazon S3. If you don't have experience using it, go to Amazon, get an account, get S3, purchase a domain name, generate a web app, and then you have buckets. You could just create folders, and it's beautiful. Okay, but anyway, if you want to run the code Lizer linter on the project, you do an ng space lint. It'll show you missing a white space. It'll give you different. I don't use this much. I'm spending most of my time trying to build a production-based application. And if you look at some of these errors, I basically reformat code and things go away. Output a version of Angular CLI. You do an ng space version or ng space v, and it should work. Okay, and then if you do something like run a unit test using Karma, basically what it'll do is it'll run all the tests with Jasmine for all the components and services, etc. And it would display the results using Karma, and basically you'll see Karma's the driver, Jasmine's provides the specs and the front end, and so basically you'll see this front end. It'll say you got 3 specs in your app component, and first of all it tested to make sure the component could be instantiated. It checks the title that app works, and it should render a title in the h1 tag, and it checked all these things. Now, needless to say, as soon as you start coding in your app component and start changing your template, none of this works. So, and what I find is updating the specs while you're really doing a lot of research, producing objects and making sure you determine what kind of implementation you want to work, it's very hard to keep up with some of the testing. As a matter of fact, I use form builders and other things that break my tests, and I'm constantly trying to update the test, and after a while it kind of makes you wonder how much time you want to be spending on coding up tests. But there's no doubt Angular CLI, when you generate a component, it generates the spec for you, and it'll test something simple in that component. So if I generate 5 components and 5 services, there'll be all the spec files, Jasmine spec files created, and the test would run and work. As soon as I start editing that, it would not. So that's all I really wanted to talk about. So let's just, I will show you some code examples in a next video tutorial, and we'll go through some of these concepts.